So I'm going to offer just a few comments about the panel. I think a question for the discussion now is what it is that we can learn from history, from analytic frames that Suzanne has provided, from current evidence that Bill has provided. I'm sure that some of the panelists will want to challenge some of the conclusions that have been drawn or endorse them and support them. They may also want to question whether the sort of evidence that each of these people has been provided is the right sort of evidence to look at as we're thinking about, what should, if you're a teacher educator, what should your program look like? If you're somebody concerned about other people's programs, what sort of guidance they should be given, what sort of policies there should be. And I have two sort of broad questions to which I don't know the answers but are raised by this. One is, what evidence and argument is needed to guide the development of teacher preparation programs? So we had evidence and argument presented up here. Are these the sort of things that can be helpful in guiding programs? And if so, what would make it more likely that the people designing programs or establishing policies about what programs should look like would pay attention to these things and take them into consideration? Because you all know that sometimes there's evidence and people either designing programs or setting policies don't pay very much attention to it. And thinking about Jack's dilemmas, the idea of dilemmas suggests that for some important issues, there's evidence really isn't the question. You've got a continuum you need to fall on somewhere. You need to have enough teachers. There's a trade-off between length and volume and investment, and there's no evidence isn't going to tell you what the right place to be there is, because it's a dilemma. There's not something that will push you in one place or the other. And the idea of context specificity came up both very strongly in Jack's presentation and in Suzanne's, and makes me wonder to what extent the teacher preparation community and the policy community should be letting the local labor markets determine what teacher preparation programs should look like. That is, to what extent should institutions be looking to the places where their students are going and saying, are we doing the right things? Given that context specificity is important, but also that we're producing teachers who are going to get certified and will be authorized to go and teach in some other context. In some of these dilemmas, there are also trade-offs between costs and benefits, both for the individuals. $50,000 was a number that was mentioned for Teach for America. I actually don't know what the number is for Michigan State, but it would be fairly high if you count all the undergraduate years plus the internship. There are costs and benefits both for the individuals going in and for society as a whole as we think about setting the requirements and how much it would cost to meet those requirements and what we get in terms of high quality instruction in schools for the teachers that come out. I think I'll just stop there. I know I'm guessing that we don't have a shy group here, that someone would be happy to go first and make a comment. Or there's Ron and there's Ken. All right, let's start down there.
So these are, is this on?
Yeah.
So these are really great presentation. I want to thank you for speaking off with such great stuff. I just had two comments. One of them is that with respect to context and more generality, context specificity, that 21% of the teachers in America work in states other than where they receive their certification. So it is a national labor market. It might not be the same as maybe engineering, but it is a national labor market and it moves across states. Some states have it more easily than others. So that's a consideration I think that's very, very important. The other one is that I'm a dean, and I've been a dean for many years. And to me, the word policy is not something to analyze and study, but something that I have to take a shower in the evening after I get engaged in. So I just wanted to try to make the discussion of policy a lot messier and value-laden and political than there we go. I had my teacher's voice, and I fooled you all. And I asked you if it was on, and you said yes. So policy is a messy, nasty, value-laden political issue. It is not something that people sit in a room quietly about and smile at each other and come out backslapping. It is nasty.
Ken?
Is this on now? Okay. I really enjoyed the presentations, the idea of looking over time. I do a lot of lately. This is my 40th year as a teacher educator in the United States. And the idea of looking at the larger context. There was something I just want to draw attention to that I've experienced, that I heard sort of alluded to, but I think it's central to understanding the evolution of teacher education and the situation now, and that is the teacher education has been largely, except in the very beginning, a public good run by public institutions, and that is changing drastically. I just think back to my own career, starting out at the University of Wisconsin in the 1970s, where the state contribution to the University of Wisconsin was about 2/3 of the university budget, and it's probably less than 1/5 now, or even less. And so there's been a decrease, not only in teacher education, but in the society general, in defunding public services of all kinds, and a shift to privatization, and education and teacher education have become investment opportunities where large sums of money are being invested in the development of different programs. Doesn't speak to the quality, but there's a difference between public funding of a public good, which many countries just do automatically, and subsidize it in various ways, becoming a teacher, where teachers who go into teacher preparation at the University of Washington in the campus-based programs, most of them end up in debt after the one-year program. And so I think that's significant, this sort of where it becomes an investment opportunity. We've seen a growth in inequality in the United States, and there are vast sums of money that accumulated in very relatively few hands, and so a lot of that money is being invested in education. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but it's a shift, and there's a difference between, and the universities are struggling in terms of being able to have the funding to do teacher education. I don't know that they've ever had adequate funding to do teacher education. That was sort of alluded to, the low status of teacher education in universities, research universities. So that's sort of one of the things that I think I'd like to see entered into the conversation.
Okay. Jack, and then somebody else like to speak after Jack? Art, okay.
I just wanted to respond to your questions by talking about something that jumped out at me from Bill's data, and that was that the thing that most jumped out at me that Bill didn't talk too much about was the online stuff. And it occurred to me that doing teacher education online is just another way of trying to manage a dilemma. And in this case, it's low cost, large scale, and you don't often see those two paired together, and the result is seemingly highly questionable quality. So that's one way to manage a dilemma. And then another way to manage a dilemma that I didn't have time to go into, and that I think comes out of in Bill's data, is the way that we currently are managing the cost volume dilemma, and that is to allow for really wide variance in the quality of teacher preparation programs and in terms of where those teachers end up. And so in some programs, we have relatively high cost, relatively small scale. So I did my doctoral work at Stanford, where we have what I think is a really great teacher education program that prepares a very tiny number of teachers pretty expensively. And then there are other programs, which Bill alluded to, that prepare a large number of teachers and are lower cost and, again, much larger scale and perhaps of some lower quality. And that currently the way that we manage this dilemma is that we are really not emphasizing the equity piece. Right? And so you have great variance there, and then you pretend that equity is not a concern, and you channel the unprepared teachers. That using the word channel makes it sound like there's a conspiracy here. You allow them to end up at the schools with traditionally underserved students. And so to respond to your question, I think the the thing that we need to pay attention to is if we can articulate this dilemma more clearly and describe it in the terms not only of problems and dilemmas, but also of, in terms of data, then I think we can begin to pay more attention to the fact that it isn't just a problem that we have a lot of unprepared teachers in the schools where kids most need prepared teachers. It's that is actually the way that we are getting more prepared teachers into the schools where students perhaps need them less right now. And that, to me, seems even more problematic.
Emily and then Arthur.
I was going to be quiet until you mentioned alternative and online in the same sentence. The presentation so far, the thing that strikes me the most is that the word technology was never used. The reason that alternative routes to teacher certification emerged in the mid-'80s and pretty well ran the ride and changed the way traditional teacher preparation institutions delivered their programs was because they were needed. They were absolutely needed. There were people who wanted to teach that didn't want to pay $100,000 to get a teacher education degree and a certification, who had bachelor's degrees, many of whom were very, very smart people, and they've become great teachers and are still teachers. The online world is the world we live in. With the internet, if I want to know where Suzanne Wilson lives and what she does, I Google everything. You Google everything. We all Google everything. So the acquisition of knowledge, the whole content piece of what it is that teachers need to know, is accessible in ways that didn't even exist before the mid-1990s. So online, 8 out of 10 of the top producers of education degrees in this country are 100% online. Look them up. So the production of teachers is not by default online, it's because that's the way people learn.
Arthur?
Actually,
You got your own?
thank you.
Nope. You're off. No?
Slide it up. Slide that up.
Slide this one up.
Yeah, that's how this one works.
There you go.
And that concludes my remarks. I've been spending a lot of my research time lately looking at the transition of higher education from agrarian America to industrial America during the Industrial Revolution. And I wonder, I love the presentations, I love them all, they were fascinating. I wonder if the history of teacher education in America doesn't have 3 periods. And the first is the period in which we had a local agrarian economy and there was no formal teacher education. The second was national industrial economy, which Jack Schneider laid out the period beautifully in terms of development of teacher education. And I wonder if we're not entering a third period, which is the global digital information economy, which is going to cause another sharp breakpoint in terms of what teacher education looks like. When we went through the first one, the stages we went through were, there was a rejection by established institutions of the need to change. Heated debate in the society among all of those, in all of our social institutions, about how they should change, why they should change, whether they needed to change, followed by experiments, followed by models, followed by standardization. And I wonder In times in which our society changes profoundly, it seems to me that every one of our social institutions, of which universities and teacher education are simply one, but our churches and government and our financial institutions and our healthcare all change. The more profoundly society changes, the more profoundly they change. I wonder if we aren't at a new breakpoint. One of the things I've found particularly helpful in understanding what's going on is I think you've got to look backward. You've got to. But you also have to look sideways. All institutions don't change at the same rate, even when facing the same pressures. And there are a number of institutions in society that have been forced to change far more rapidly than higher education has. A great example is media and newspapers. And I wonder if we can learn a lot by looking at those in terms of both the challenges and the prospects and the possibilities for teacher education in entering a new era.
Thanks. Time for 2 more comments. Bill, and then Aaron. Okay.
Actually, I just wanted to ask a question of my colleagues. Of that observation I made, do you see any significance? Oh, closer, sorry. I wanted to ask my fellow colleagues, I made an observation which seemed important to me, which is that there are 80% of all of our future teachers that are being prepared at institutions in which research is not a very prominent part of the zeitgeist of that institution. That's not to say that other institutions can't use research, the faculty, but it's still not a front and center thing. Could that be significant? Because that would also include educational research. That just stuck out at me from the data.
Aaron, you can answer that, or you can make your own comments.
I'm tempted to answer with a discussion about what is research, but that's probably a different conversation. So my head right now is really appreciating the framing of dilemmas as what we should all be thinking about in the course of this conversation, and dilemmas having trade-offs, not a definitive answer, so thank you for that. It's really helpful. As I work with a teacher preparation program, I'm thinking about all these different pieces that I'd love to pull back and tell my colleagues about and other strategies we might try. And I realize that without understanding the trade-offs we've already made, trying to borrow somebody else's solution is not the way for our program to move forward. So I'm really excited as we talk about some of the other programs, and I'm going to try to force myself to keep that in mind as I hear some of the other strategies that programs are using.
Okay, we actually have time for 1 more. And someone else? Suzanne, you have the last word here.
Oh, Lord. I changed my mind. So in terms of Bill's question and your question about warrants, whether the warrant. So I have this idea that in my paper at some point I will have a section called The Wacky World of Non-Warrants in the current discourse. And it might be related to Art's point about a global digital information economy and Emily's point about how we get information these days. When we, so if you're in the educational establishment, then you have, for the last 20 years, experienced an increasing amounts of pressure to have evidence for making any claims that you want to make, and not taking action without some kind of evidence, and that evidence has sometimes been evidence that's been labeled, it has to come from a certain kind of paradigm, and if it's coming from another, it's not evidence. But when one is in this wacky world in which there's a lot of innovation, people have different frames for why they get to do what they do, and they don't necessarily have to have any evidence. This is one of the things that happens with quote-unquote innovation. There's some innovation where people are very, very thoughtful about learning, having reasons for what they do, and there's some innovation where people say, I want to do this because it sounds like a really nifty idea, and the landscape of teacher prep right now has both of those, and that's a feature of the digital world, because when you Google, you can get appropriate information or inappropriate information. And so I think I think there's something going on where there's something about the role that evidence does or doesn't play in the contemporary landscape that we need to bear down on. And Bill, in terms of your question, I think Arthur's earlier report about teacher preparation institutions made this really clear, that so many teacher preparation programs don't occur in environments in which people on the same hallway are doing research and thinking about things in a kind of scholarly way, and how that affects the nature of responsive, ongoing change that's informed by our efforts to continuously learn as much as we can about what research is producing, and that it may be that teacher preparation has to happen in a lot of different environments, but one thing that I think we really do need to think about is how, if teacher preparation is not happening in a situation in which there are appropriate channels for getting new knowledge into the system, we have to create those channels. And one of the things that's striking to me right now is that even in the educational establishment, we have no way of synthesizing knowledge and getting it to teacher preparation programs, even in universities. We don't, as a field, do that regularly. And so I think this issue about being close to knowledge and how we create channels to get knowledge to places of practice, but also get knowledge back from those places of practice is core in understanding the current landscape.
Okay. So please join me in thanking the panelists.